Hello, so this is video number 3 and this one is an uphill. I've had some questions about how this relates to A Doll's House, so that's going to be the focus for this poem because I think in many ways it's quite straightforward. Again, before you watch the video, I recommend you read through the 2 study guides I provided. They do give a really thorough analysis, so hopefully I'll just do a quick kind of run through of the meaning of the poem and then I will link to A Doll's House. So as always, this one was written in 1858. It was actually published in Macmillan magazine in 1861, and then it was, along with a lot of these poems we're looking at, published in her Goblin Market collection in 1862. Point to make that this was one of her first poems that really got a lot of attention. Her lovely brother William felt the need to point out. So interesting to see this is one of the first ones that made her quite successful, I suppose, or began to see her getting attention as a writer. So it's quite a simple poem. As you can see, it's 4 stanzas, but what's interesting is the structure, and again that caveat, we're not getting marks for structure per se because there's no analysis, but if you can link the structure of this poem somehow to the structure of A Doll's House, then it is worth mentioning. So what I mean by that is don't just talk about these, the use of questions and answers here, which is how this is formed if you have a look, but think about how that is similar to the way characters speak to each other in A Doll's House. Again, I'll talk about the specifics when we've gone through it. So as I said, you'll notice this poem has questions and does the road wind uphill all the way? Yes, to the very end. Will the day's journey take the whole long day? From morn to night, my friend. So quite straightforward. You have 2 questions and 2 answers, and we seem to have 2 speakers as a result. And you have the person asking the questions and the person giving the answers. Again, so far so straightforward. You've also got the word uphill here, which gives you this idea of this kind of climb. Now, obviously, we have talked about this when we looked at A Doll's House, this idea of climbing up the stairs, which sounds like a really small, insignificant fact, but in this poem, although there are several interpretations, as always, this journey up the hill is that journey to heaven. So that climb, that ascent, that is quite, if you think about a road going up a hill, it's quite difficult, that suggests it is a struggle. So in this poem, it is all about that journey to heaven. Now, you can interpret that as a journey to redemption. Now, that is when I think you get your first big link to A Doll's House, because of our good friend Krogstad, who is struggling to redeem himself. And he uses that image of the ladder. He talks about being thrown back in the dirt, that he'd made his way back up and he's been thrown back down again. So his attempts to redeem his reputation are mirrored by the speaker's attempts to kind of to salvation, to heaven, this struggle. And I think that links in really nicely with the context of the Victorian era. So if you take Krogstad, for example, as a middle-class man whose reputation has been damaged, he is struggling with his ability to remake himself. Nora is also struggling to, again, make a name for herself in a very different way. And then you obviously have Christine, who also is trying to redeem herself in a slightly different way. She's trying to remake her life. And actually, interestingly, Krogstad uses the image of the ladder, but both he and Christine, it's referenced to them several times about them being on the stairs in the Torvald and Nora's home. And she actually stops on the stairs because she can't cope with them, and she has to pause because she's tired, because she's been working so hard, blah blah blah. But that point being, this image of this kind of eternal struggle is quite clearly shared between the 2 texts, although in slightly different ways. Now, another kind of more general connection you can make is the fact that you have these questions here, and some people interpret this second speaker who is giving the answers as almost like a Jesus figure. And in the sense that, you know, they're referring to the speaker as my friend, having the answers, being very comforting, and it's that reassurance, whether it's Jesus or not. It's this idea of reassurance from the second voice, that whoever the questioner is, they are being reassured. Now, that's quite interesting when you think about Nora at the end of the text, at the end of the play, when she is arguing with, well, not so much arguing, but she's being yelled at by Torvald, and eventually kind of makes her decisions for herself. And he's trying to persuade her to stay, and saying stuff like, what about your religion, what about your duties? And she kind of makes that point of saying she doesn't really know what those things are. So it's interesting, kind of that ignorance of the speaker and the ignorance of Nora in very different ways. An interesting connection here. So just another point to make about this poem, it's using this image. So in that sense, I guess, again, it is an allegory. It's using this image of a journey up a hill, literally, to an inn, and so the resting place and the image of the inn obviously is the destination. Now, the point of a resting place or an inn is they're not permanent, and I think that's a point to make with this poem. You know, you stay there, you don't live at your inn. You know, you stay there and then you move on with your journey to wherever you want to go. So if we go back to Rossetti's religion, and I think it's very important to take that into account here. So that is both AO3 and AO5, because we use her religion to then make an interpretation of this, what this inn represents. Now, there's an article that I attached to this lesson, which was about her religious beliefs, and as part of her belief as what she was called a Tractarian, that was the sort of movement she followed. She was basically an Anglican, so not a Catholic, Church of England, but a high Anglican. But the Tractarian she followed had very specific views. We'll talk about that later when we come to her birthday. But the point being, she believed that when you died, you didn't go straight to heaven, you did what's called soul sleep. And that basically meant you kind of hung out for a bit until the end of days. So actually, when you take that interpretation, that's what this is saying, that she's making her way to heaven, but the inn is just a stopping off place. So again, it's quite a complex article to have a look at, but it does give a really good interpretation of this poem, in case you're wondering why. You know, this isn't about her going to heaven, this is about her stopping off. How would we then link that to A Doll's House? Well, think about the end of the play, Nora's new life. And she wants to go back to her hometown so she can find herself. So in a slightly different way, Nora is sort of reborn at the end of the play as a new independent woman. And for Rossetti, death was your way of getting into heaven, and so they both have these sort of periods of transition between life and death, or death and I suppose a rebirth. So for Rossetti that would be the afterlife, for Nora that's her life as a fully realized human. So it's quite a complex comparison to make, but it's an interesting one. The only other thing connections I would make, just the question here, is this idea of the struggle again. Shall I find comfort, travel sore and weak? And I think that goes really nicely with Christine, and also Krogstad and their struggle to survive in this, this current world. The fact that Christine is working so hard that she is unrecognizable to Nora because she's so much older, and Krogstad, this image of the cold outside, he comes in wearing lots of fur, which is quite funny in the film of it, but the point being that they've both struggled and they are rewarded with their relationship, interestingly. And for Rossetti's speaker, she or they are looking for the reward of this resting place before they can go to heaven. And again, this idea that for all who seek, beds for all who come, this idea that not everyone is going to make it to heaven, because not everyone is looking to get there. So that's an interesting comparison to Torvald, that he actually isn't happy at the end of the play, but he's also not really looking to be happy because he doesn't know any different. Nora, on the other hand, is seeking something else. Krogstad and Christina seeking something else. Torvald's very happy with the status quo. So in that sense, it's an interesting comparison to make. So I hope that's enough with you to go with for now. If you have any questions, put them in the comments or send me an email. Thanks.